In the grand halls of Ravencrest Palace, where centuries of royal blood have walked before, a single document hidden beneath a loose floorboard would shatter everything King Edmund thought he knew about his family's legacy. When his stepmother, Queen Consort Isabella, discovered the ancient deed that morning, her trembling hands held more than parchment. They held the power to rewrite history itself. But some secrets, once awakened, demand a price that even royalty cannot afford to pay. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Ravencrest Palace like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the fortress that had stood for 800 years. Inside the Grand Library, King Edmund Ravencrest sat hunched over ledgers that chronicled his realm's declining finances, his weathered hands tracing columns of numbers that seemed to mock his every effort at economic recovery. At 58, Edmund carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders, shoulders that had grown stooped not from age but from the burden of responsibility inherited too young. His father, King Marcus, had died unexpectedly in a hunting accident when Edmund was barely 30, thrusting him into a role he had never felt prepared for. Now, nearly 3 decades later, the kingdom of Valdoria faced its greatest crisis yet. The recent war with the neighboring realm of Astoria had drained the royal treasury, leaving barely enough to maintain the palace staff, let alone fund the infrastructure projects the kingdom desperately needed. The people were growing restless, and whispers of discontent echoed through the countryside like a gathering storm. Edmund's second wife, Isabella, had been a beacon of hope when they married 5 years earlier. 20 years his junior and daughter of a wealthy merchant family from the prosperous southern provinces, she had brought not only her father's considerable dowry, but also fresh perspectives on trade and commerce. Her intelligence and beauty had captivated not just the king but the entire court, and many believed she would be the salvation Valdoria needed. However, recent months had strained their relationship. Isabella's increasing involvement in state affairs had begun to rankle the traditional nobles, who whispered that a commoner's daughter, regardless of her marriage to the king, had no right to influence policy. More troubling to Edmund were the subtle changes in his wife's demeanor. The way her eyes would grow calculating during council meetings, the private conversations that ceased whenever he entered a room, and, most disturbing of all, her growing friendship with his estranged brother, Prince Roderick. Roderick had been absent from court for nearly a decade, choosing exile over allegiance after a bitter dispute over their father's will. When he had returned 6 months ago, claiming to seek reconciliation, Edmund had welcomed him despite his advisor's warnings. Family meant everything to the Ravencrests, or so Edmund had always believed. The library door creaked open, interrupting his brooding thoughts. Isabella entered, her silk gown rustling against the marble floor. Even in the dim morning light, she was breathtaking, with auburn hair that caught the firelight and emerald eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Today, however, those eyes held something different, a mixture of excitement and apprehension that immediately put Edmund on alert. "My lord," she said, her voice carrying a tremor he had never heard before. "There is something of utmost importance I must share with you." Edmund set down his quill and studied his wife's face. In her hands, she clutched what appeared to be an ancient document, its edges yellowed with age and its surface bearing the unmistakable marks of royal seals. "What have you found, Isabella?" She approached his desk with careful steps, as if the document might crumble at any sudden movement. "I was overseeing the restoration of the East Wing chambers, the ones that belonged to your great-grandmother, Queen Cordelia. The workers discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose stone in the wall. Inside was this." With reverent hands, she placed the document before him. Edmund's breath caught as he recognized the distinctive burgundy wax seal of his ancestor, King Aldrich the Just, who had ruled 3 centuries earlier. The parchment bore the elaborate script of royal scribes, and, as Edmund began to read, the color drained from his face. The document was a will, but not just any will. It was a secret codicil to King Aldrich's testament, one that had apparently been hidden away and forgotten by history. According to the carefully crafted language, King Aldrich had decreed that in the event his direct bloodline should face financial ruin, certain crown lands and treasures, specifically the legendary Ravencrest Emerald Collection and the vast Northwood territories, should be held in trust for the realm's preservation. But it was the final clause that made Edmund's hands tremble. The will stated that if the ruling monarch proved unable to restore the kingdom's prosperity within 5 years of economic crisis being declared, these assets should pass to the most capable member of the royal household, regardless of birth order or gender, who demonstrates both wisdom and the means to restore the realm's glory. Isabella watched her husband's face intently as he read, her own expression carefully neutral. Do you understand what this means, Edmund? Edmund's mind raced through the implications. The Raven Crest Emerald Collection alone was worth more than the entire royal treasury had been at its peak. The Northwood territories contained some of the most valuable timber and mineral rights in the known world. Together, these assets could not only solve Valdoria's financial crisis, but could make the kingdom one of the wealthiest realms in the continent. This document, Edmund said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, if authentic, could change everything. But, Isabella, who else knows of this discovery? A shadow crossed Isabella's features. Only myself and Prince Roderick. He was with me when the workers made the discovery. In fact, it was his suggestion to examine the hidden compartment more thoroughly. The mention of his brother's involvement sent a chill down Edmund's spine. Roderick had always been the more charismatic of the two brothers, the one their father had secretly favored despite Edmund being the elder. During their youth, many nobles had whispered that Roderick possessed the natural leadership qualities that Edmund seemed to lack. You must understand, Isabella continued, settling into the chair across from his desk. This discovery presents us with both an opportunity and a dilemma. The kingdom is indeed in financial crisis, as this document defines it. The question is whether you, as the current monarch, can demonstrate the capability to restore prosperity, or whether the assets should pass to another member of the royal household. Edmund felt a growing unease at his wife's carefully chosen words. Another member? Isabella, surely you don't mean, I mean that we must consider all possibilities, she interrupted gently but firmly. Your brother has proven himself quite capable during his travels. His trading ventures in the Eastern Kingdoms have made him wealthy beyond measure. Perhaps this discovery is Providence showing us a path forward. The king stood abruptly, pacing to the great window that overlooked the palace courtyard. Below, servants went about their morning duties, unaware that their world might be about to change forever. The weight of his crown, both literal and metaphorical, had never felt heavier. You speak as if this decision has already been made, Edmund said, not turning from the window. As if I have already been judged and found wanting. Isabella rose and moved to stand behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. No, my lord. I speak only of realities we must face. The document exists. Its provisions are clear, and time is not our ally. Edmund turned to face his wife, searching her beautiful features for some sign of the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had stood by his side through the darkest days of the war. Instead, he found the calculating gaze of someone who seemed to be measuring him for a role he might no longer be fit to play. What do you propose we do? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. We must convene the royal council, Isabella replied without hesitation. Present the document. Allow the wisest minds in the kingdom to determine the best path forward. If you can prove your capability to restore the realm's prosperity, then the assets remain with you. If not, she let the implication hang in the air like smoke. Edmund nodded slowly, though his heart hammered against his ribs. He had faced enemy armies and political crises, but nothing had prepared him for the possibility that his own family might orchestrate his downfall. Yet as he looked at the ancient document that Isabella had so conveniently discovered, he began to wonder if this moment had been orchestrated long before either of them had entered the library that morning. Very well, he said finally. Summon the council for tomorrow at dawn. But, Isabella, I want you to understand something clearly. I will not surrender my crown or my kingdom without a fight. If this document is authentic, then I will prove myself worthy of keeping what is rightfully mine. Isabella smiled, but there was something cold in her expression that made Edmund's blood run chill. Of course, my lord. I would expect nothing less from a true king. As she glided from the library, the ancient document clutched in her hands. Edmund remained at the window, staring out at his kingdom, and wondering if he was looking at it for one of the last times as its undisputed ruler. In the distance, he could see riders approaching the palace gates, and something in his gut told him that his brother Roderick was about to make a very timely appearance. The game, it seemed, had already begun. The royal council chamber had witnessed countless momentous decisions throughout Valdoria's history, but as dawn broke over Ravencrest Palace, the tension within its stone walls felt unprecedented. King Edmund sat at the head of the ancient oak table, its surface scarred by centuries of use, while 12 of the realm's most powerful nobles took their places around him. Isabella entered the chamber with practiced grace, the mysterious document secured in an ornate silver case that caught the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. Her timing was perfect, Edmund noted grimly. Exactly as Prince Roderick strode through the opposite entrance, his travel cloak still dusty from what appeared to be a hurried journey. Roderick had changed little during his years of exile. At 53, he remained tall and commanding, with the same dark hair as Edmund, but without the threads of silver that stress had woven through the king's temples. His clothes spoke of wealth, fine silk doublet, perfectly crafted leather boots, and a sword whose jeweled hilt suggested both prosperity and power. Most telling of all was his demeanor. Where Edmund carried the weight of kingship like a burden, Roderick moved with the confidence of a man who had conquered the world on his own terms. "Brother," Roderick said, offering a respectful bow that somehow managed to convey familiarity rather than subservience. "I came as soon as I received word of this council meeting. Though I confess, the message was rather cryptic about its purpose." Lord Chancellor Aldwin, a man whose loyalty to the crown had never been questioned in 40 years of service, cleared his throat meaningfully. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should begin with an explanation of why this emergency session has been called." Edmund's jaw tightened. He had hoped to control the narrative, to present the document's discovery in a way that emphasized his continued authority. Instead, he felt like a defendant awaiting judgment. "Lady Isabella has made a discovery that may have significant implications for the realm. I shall let her explain." All eyes turned to the queen consort as she rose gracefully, the silver case held before her like a sacred relic. "Honorable lords, what I am about to reveal will challenge everything we thought we knew about our kingdom's heritage." With practiced theater, Isabella recounted the discovery of the hidden compartment, though Edmund noticed she omitted certain details, such as exactly how she had known where to look, or why Roderick had been present during what should have been routine restoration work. As she spoke, she gradually built the tension in the room until even the most jaded nobles leaned forward in their seats. When she finally opened the case and revealed the ancient document, the chamber fell into absolute silence. Lord Chancellor Aldwin examined the parchment with the expertise of someone who had spent decades studying royal documents, while the other nobles waited with barely contained anticipation. "The seals appear authentic," Aldwin announced finally, his voice heavy with the weight of what this meant. "The script is consistent with documents from King Aldrich's reign, and the parchment itself bears the characteristics of that period. I would need more time for a complete analysis, but preliminary examination suggests this is genuine." A murmur ran through the chamber like wind through autumn leaves. Duke Harrison, whose family had served the crown for generations, was the first to speak. "Your Majesty, if this document is authentic, then we must consider its implications carefully. The kingdom's financial situation is precarious." "Precarious?" Lord Commander Garrett, a gruff military man who had led Valdoria's armies through the recent war, laughed bitterly. "We're one harvest failure away from complete collapse. The army's pay is 3 months in arrears, and half the kingdom's bridges are falling apart. I'd say we've moved well beyond precarious." Edmund felt the walls of the chamber closing in around him. These men had been his supporters, his advisors, his friends. Now he could see calculation in their eyes as they weighed their loyalty to him against the kingdom's needs. "The document's provisions are quite specific," Isabella continued, her voice carrying across the chamber with crystal clarity. "Should the current monarch prove unable to restore the realm's prosperity within the timeframe established, the specified assets would transfer to the most capable member of the royal household." Prince Roderick, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. "Sister," he said, using the familial term despite their relationship being only through marriage, "surely you're not suggesting that my brother has failed in his duties. Edmund has led this kingdom through war and hardship with courage and determination." The words were supportive, but Edmund detected something else beneath them, a subtle positioning that acknowledged the king's efforts while implying they had not been sufficient. It was masterfully done, and Edmund realized his brother had learned more than just commerce during his years away. "No one questions His Majesty's dedication," Duke Harrison said carefully. "But dedication alone cannot fill empty coffers or rebuild crumbling infrastructure. The question before us is practical. Can the kingdom's finances be restored under current leadership?" Lord Aldwin set down the ancient document with reverent care. "Your Majesty, I feel compelled to point out that this council cannot simply ignore a legitimate royal decree, regardless of its age. If King Aldrich will includes provisions for the transfer of crown assets under specific circumstances, and if those circumstances currently exist, then we have a legal and moral obligation to consider its implementation. The chamber erupted in controlled but intense discussion. Edmund listened as his nobles debated his fitness to rule, their voices rising and falling like waves against a crumbling shore. Through it all, Isabella and Roderick remained remarkably composed, occasionally exchanging glances that spoke of shared understanding. Enough! Edmund's voice cut through the debate like a blade. The chamber fell silent as he rose to his full height, every inch the king despite the circumstances threatening to overwhelm him. I have listened to your concerns, and I acknowledge the gravity of this discovery. But I will not sit here while my own council debates my removal as if I were already dead. He moved to stand beside the ancient document, his hand resting on its surface. This will speaks of capability and wisdom. Very well. I propose that we test those qualities properly. Give me 6 months, half the time this document allows, to demonstrate that I can restore the kingdom's prosperity. If I fail, then we shall revisit this discussion. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Lord Commander Garrett spoke up. Your Majesty, with respect, what makes you believe you can accomplish in 6 months what has not been achieved in the past several years? Edmund had been hoping someone would ask that question. Because, Lord Commander, I have been working in isolation, believing that the Crown's resources were limited to what we could generate through traditional means. But this discovery changes everything. Even the knowledge that these assets exist opens new possibilities for negotiation with our creditors and trading partners. It was a reasonable argument, but Edmund could see doubt in the faces around the table. Prince Roderick leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Brother, Roderick said slowly, your proposal is fair, but perhaps incomplete. Should you not have assistance in this endeavor? After all, the document speaks of the most capable member of the royal household. Perhaps capability can be demonstrated through collaboration rather than individual effort. Edmund's eyes narrowed. Here was the trap being sprung. What do you propose, Roderick? I propose that you allow me to return to court permanently, to serve as your chief advisor on economic matters. My success in international trade could benefit the kingdom directly. Together, we might accomplish what neither of us could achieve alone. It was a clever move, Edmund had to admit. Roderick was positioning himself not as a usurper, but as a collaborator, making any refusal seem petty and counterproductive. Isabella nodded approvingly, and Edmund realized that this entire scene had been choreographed in advance. Duke Harrison seized on the suggestion immediately. Prince Roderick's proposal has merit, Your Majesty. His trading networks could provide immediate relief while longer-term solutions are developed. Other nobles murmured agreement, and Edmund found himself backed into a corner. To refuse his brother's help would appear prideful and potentially harmful to the kingdom. To accept it would mean bringing a potential rival directly into the heart of his government. Very well, Edmund said finally. Prince Roderick, I accept your offer of assistance. But let me be clear to everyone in this chamber. I remain king of Valdoria. Any actions taken will be under my authority and with my approval. Roderick rose and bowed deeply. Of course, brother. I seek only to serve the crown and the kingdom. As the council session concluded, Edmund watched his nobles file out of the chamber, their conversations already turning to the implications of the morning's revelations. Isabella approached him with the silver case, her smile warm but her eyes unreadable. This could be the beginning of a new golden age for Valdoria, she said softly. With you and Roderick working together, with the assets this document promises, the kingdom could become greater than ever before. Edmund nodded, but his mind was racing with darker thoughts. He had just agreed to bring his potential replacement into the very heart of his administration, while his wife, who had supposedly discovered the document by chance, seemed remarkably well prepared for every turn the conversation had taken. As he walked back to his private chambers, Edmund couldn't shake the feeling that he had just participated in the opening moves of his own downfall. The document might be ancient, but the plot surrounding it felt distinctly contemporary. The question now was whether he could outmaneuver his opponents before they completed whatever game they had started. In the distance, church bells rang across the kingdom, calling the faithful to morning prayer. Edmund found himself hoping that divine intervention might be his only hope, because human cunning seemed to be arrayed against him on all sides. The next 6 months would determine not just his fate, but the future of the kingdom itself. 3 months into the trial period, The royal court of Valdoria buzzed with an energy that had been absent for years. Prince Roderick's return had indeed brought immediate changes, though not all of them were what King Edmund had expected. The prince's extensive network of trading contacts had resulted in several lucrative agreements that helped stabilize the kingdom's immediate financial crisis. But, with each success, Edmund noticed a subtle shift in the court's dynamics. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the royal accounting chamber as Edmund reviewed the latest financial reports. The numbers were encouraging. Tax revenues had increased by 15%, and new trade agreements had brought in substantial fees. However, these improvements had come at a cost Edmund was only beginning to understand. Isabella entered the chamber carrying a silver tray with his morning meal, a gesture that had once seemed loving but now felt calculated. She had taken to personally serving him his meals, claiming it was her way of ensuring he maintained his strength during these challenging times. Edmund wondered if there were other reasons for her increased attention to his daily routine. "The reports look promising," she said, setting the tray down and glancing at the ledgers spread across his desk. "Roderick's contacts in the merchant guilds have proven invaluable. The silk trade agreement alone will generate enough revenue to repair the eastern bridges." Edmund nodded absently, though something nagged at him about the ease with which these agreements had been reached. International trade negotiations typically took months or even years to complete, yet Roderick had managed to finalize several major deals within weeks of his return. It suggested a level of preparation and pre-existing relationships that made Edmund uncomfortable. "Has my brother mentioned anything about his plans for the remaining 3 months?" Edmund asked, sampling the fruit on his breakfast tray. "He speaks of expanding the agreements to include military supplies," Isabella replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Apparently, his contacts in the Eastern Kingdoms are quite interested in Valdorian steel. It could provide enough income to restore the royal treasury completely." The mention of military supplies sent alarm bells ringing in Edmund's mind. Control of weapons and armor sales was traditionally a royal prerogative, closely guarded to prevent potential enemies from gaining access to Valdorian military technology. Yet here was Roderick, apparently negotiating deals that could fundamentally alter the kingdom's strategic position. A knock at the chamber door interrupted his thoughts. Lord Chancellor Aldwin entered, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "Your Majesty, there is a matter of some urgency that requires your attention." Edmund gestured for the Chancellor to continue, though he noticed Isabella's posture stiffen slightly, a reaction that seemed disproportionate to what appeared to be routine court business. "I have received reports from our border guards," Aldwin continued, his voice carefully neutral. "It seems that Prince Roderick has been meeting with representatives from the Kingdom of Astoria, our former enemies. These meetings have been conducted without official sanction or oversight." The fruit Edmund had been eating suddenly tasted like ash. Astoria had been Valdoria's primary adversary in the recent war, and any unauthorized contact with their representatives could be considered treasonous. Yet his brother's activities had apparently been extensive enough to attract the attention of border guards, suggesting they were neither secret nor small in scale. Isabella's reaction was swift and defensive. "Surely there's a reasonable explanation. Roderick has mentioned the importance of normalizing trade relationships with all neighboring kingdoms, including former adversaries. Perhaps these meetings were simply preliminary discussions." "Perhaps," Aldwin replied, though his tone suggested skepticism. "However, the reports indicate that these meetings have involved the exchange of documents and what appeared to be substantial payments. Our guards have observed Astrian couriers leaving these meetings with sealed packages." Edmund felt the room begin to spin slightly, though he attributed it to the stress of the revelation rather than any physical cause. His brother's behavior was becoming increasingly suspicious, and the timing of these discoveries was troubling. 3 months remained in the trial period, and if Roderick was indeed plotting something, the endgame was approaching rapidly. "Summon my brother immediately," Edmund commanded, rising from his chair. The movement made him slightly dizzy, and he gripped the edge of his desk for support. Isabella was instantly at his side, her hand on his arm with apparent concern. "Edmund, you look pale. Perhaps you should rest before confronting Roderick. These accusations are serious, and you'll want to be at your full strength." The suggestion made sense, but Edmund's instincts told him that delay could be dangerous. However, as he tried to take a step toward the door, his legs felt unsteady, and a wave of nausea washed over him. Perhaps you're right. Lord Chancellor, have Prince Roderick attend me here in 1 hour, and ensure that the meeting is properly witnessed." Aldwin bowed and departed, leaving Edmund alone with Isabella. She helped him back to his chair, her touch gentle and supportive, but Edmund found himself studying her face with new suspicion. The timing of his sudden illness, combined with her defensive reaction to the accusations against Roderick, created a pattern that he didn't want to acknowledge. "Isabella," he said carefully, "how long have you known about Roderick's meetings with the Astorians?" Her hand froze on his shoulder for just a moment, a hesitation so brief that someone not specifically watching for it might have missed it entirely. "Known about them? Edmund, I've heard no mention of any meetings beyond Lord Chancellor Aldwin's report just now." It was a lie. Edmund was certain of it, though he couldn't yet prove it. The pieces of a conspiracy were falling into place in his mind. Isabella's convenient discovery of the ancient document, Roderick's perfectly timed return to court, the suspiciously successful trade negotiations, and, now unauthorized meetings with former enemies. Each element alone might be explained innocently, but together they formed a picture of elaborate deception. "Perhaps I should rest," Edmund said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the growing conviction that his wife was slowly poisoning him. "But first, I want you to personally ensure that the ancient document remains secure. If something were to happen to me before the trial period ends, that document becomes the most important artifact in the kingdom." Isabella's eyes flashed with something that might have been surprise or calculation. "Of course, my lord. Though surely you're not suggesting that you're in any danger? You're simply overwrought from the stress of recent events." Edmund smiled, though it felt more like a grimace. "Perhaps. But humor a suspicious old king, won't you? Have the document moved to the royal vault, under guard. Only you, myself, and Lord Chancellor Aldwin should have access." "As you wish," Isabella replied. But Edmund could see her mind working behind her eyes. He had just complicated whatever plan she and Roderick had devised, and her reaction told him everything he needed to know about the validity of his suspicions. After Isabella left to arrange the document's security, Edmund remained in his chair, his thoughts racing despite his physical weakness. The poisoning, for he was now certain that's what it was, had been subtle and gradual, designed to make him appear increasingly unfit to rule while avoiding suspicion of foul play. Combined with the financial pressures and the convenient discovery of the document that could legally transfer his crown's most valuable assets, it was an elegant plot. But Edmund had not survived 3 decades of kingship by being naive. He had resources that his conspirators might not have considered, and 3 months was still enough time to turn the tables if he acted carefully. The question was whether his body could withstand the effects of whatever poison Isabella was administering long enough for him to expose the conspiracy and save both his crown and his kingdom. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of his personal physician, Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a man whose loyalty to the royal family had never been questioned. Edmund had sent for him secretly, using a trusted servant who had served his father before him. "Your Majesty," Dr. Whitmore said quietly, closing the door behind him. "You mentioned feeling unwell?" "Doctor," Edmund said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to examine me, but I also need you to do so with absolute discretion. I have reason to believe that someone may be attempting to harm me, and if my suspicions are correct, any open investigation could be dangerous for both of us." Dr. Whitmore's expression grew grave as he approached the king. "What symptoms have you been experiencing?" "Gradual weakness, occasional nausea, dizziness, and a general feeling of malaise that has worsened over the past month," Edmund replied. "The symptoms appear most pronounced after meals, particularly breakfast." The doctor's examination was thorough but conducted under the pretense of a routine check of the king's health. When he finished, his face was pale. "Your Majesty, I cannot make a definitive diagnosis without proper testing, but your symptoms are consistent with gradual poisoning by several substances. Mercury compounds, for instance, or certain plant-based toxins that accumulate in the body over time." Edmund's worst fears were confirmed, but, strangely, the knowledge brought him a sense of relief. At least now he understood the nature of the threat he faced. Can the effects be reversed? If caught early enough, yes. But we would need to identify the specific poison and begin treatment immediately. More importantly, we must identify and eliminate the source of the poisoning. Edmund nodded grimly. He knew the source, but proving it would require careful planning. "Doctor, I need you to prepare an antidote treatment, but do so secretly. And I need you to help me create the appearance that the poisoning is progressing more rapidly than it actually is." Dr. Whitmore looked confused. "Your Majesty, if someone is trying to kill me slowly, they're doing so for a reason. They need me to appear increasingly unfit to rule while maintaining plausible deniability about the cause. If I suddenly recover, they'll know their plot has been discovered and may take more drastic action. But if they believe they're succeeding, they may become careless and reveal themselves completely. The doctor's understanding dawned slowly. You want to pretend to be dying while secretly recovering? Exactly. And, doctor, if my suspicions are correct, the next 3 months will determine whether Valdoria remains a free kingdom or falls under the control of those who would sell it to the highest bidder. Your discretion isn't just protecting me, it's protecting the realm itself. As Dr. Whitmore left to begin his secret preparations, Edmund settled back in his chair to wait for his brother's arrival. The game had become deadly serious, but now that he understood the rules, he intended to play to win. The question was whether he could outmaneuver his enemies before they realized their prey had become the hunter. In the distance, he could hear the sound of horses approaching the palace courtyard. Prince Roderick was arriving for their confrontation, unaware that his brother now knew far more about his activities than he suspected. The next hour would be crucial in determining how the final phase of this deadly game would unfold. The confrontation between the royal brothers took place in the throne room, a deliberate choice by King Edmund to emphasize the formal nature of their discussion. The ancient chamber, with its towering columns and stained glass windows depicting centuries of Valdorian history, had witnessed countless moments of political drama, but rarely had the stakes been so personal. Prince Roderick entered with his characteristic confidence intact, though Edmund noticed a subtle tension in his bearing that suggested awareness that this meeting was different from their previous encounters. Lord Chancellor Aldwin stood as witness, his presence lending official weight to whatever transpired. "Brother," Roderick said, offering a bow that was precisely measured to show respect without subservience. "You summoned me with some urgency. I hope the kingdom's business proceeds well." Edmund studied his brother's face carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or deception. Roderick's expression remained pleasantly neutral, but Edmund had learned to read the micro-expressions that betrayed deeper thoughts. There, a slight tightening around the eyes when he mentioned the kingdom's business, suggesting awareness that this meeting might not proceed as expected. "The kingdom's business is indeed the subject of our discussion," Edmund replied, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for official proceedings. "Lord Chancellor Aldwin has brought to my attention some concerning reports about your activities during your time here." Roderick's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the mask of casual confidence giving way to something more guarded. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Your Majesty. My activities have been entirely focused on improving Valdoria's economic position, as we agreed, including unauthorized meetings with representatives of the Kingdom of Astoria." Edmund's question cut through the chamber like a blade. The silence that followed was profound. Roderick's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing a flash of something that might have been anger or perhaps simply annoyance at being discovered. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to one of careful explanation. "Brother, I can understand how such meetings might appear suspicious without proper context. However, my conversations with Astorian representatives have been entirely commercial in nature. The war between our kingdoms damaged both economies, and there are opportunities for mutually beneficial trade relationships that could help both realms recover." It was a reasonable explanation, delivered with conviction, but Edmund had expected nothing less from his brother. Roderick had always been skilled at making questionable actions sound perfectly logical. Commercial negotiations that require the exchange of sealed documents and substantial payments? Lord Chancellor Aldwin interjected. "Our border guards reported observing Astorian couriers leaving your meetings with packages that appeared to contain more than simple trade agreements." Roderick turned his attention to the Chancellor, his expression hardening slightly. "Lord Chancellor, I'm surprised that the Crown is having its own family members spied upon. The payments you mentioned were advance fees for exclusive trading rights, and the documents were detailed specifications for the goods we plan to exchange. All perfectly normal business practices." Edmund watched this exchange with growing unease, though not for the reasons his brother might expect. The explanations were too smooth, too well prepared. It suggested that Roderick had anticipated this confrontation and had his responses ready. More troubling was the underlying assumption in his brother's words, that he had the authority to negotiate exclusive trading rights on behalf of the kingdom without official sanction. "Roderick," Edmund said quietly, "under what authority did you promise exclusive trading rights to a foreign power?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Prince Roderick's eyes narrowed as he realized he had revealed more than intended. When he spoke again, his voice carried a harder edge. Under the authority of necessity, brother, the kingdom faces financial collapse, and traditional diplomatic channels move too slowly to address our immediate needs. I took the initiative to secure deals that will benefit Valdoria, regardless of whether they follow conventional protocols. Traditional diplomatic channels exist for reasons beyond mere convention, Edmund replied, his voice growing colder. They prevent individual nobles, even princes, from making commitments that could compromise the kingdom's sovereignty or security. Roderick's facade of respectful cooperation finally began to crumble. Sovereignty? Security? Edmund, this kingdom is weeks away from bankruptcy. The people are suffering while you maintain your pride and traditional protocols. Sometimes leadership requires making difficult decisions without the luxury of endless deliberation. The words stung because they contained elements of truth, but Edmund recognized them as a manipulation technique, acknowledging real problems while positioning the speaker as the only viable solution. It was a strategy Roderick had perfected during their youth, and seeing it deployed against him now confirmed Edmund's growing suspicions about his brother's ultimate intentions. You speak of leadership, Edmund said, rising from his throne despite the weakness that still plagued his body. But what you describe sounds more like usurpation. Making commitments on behalf of the crown without authorization, conducting secret negotiations with foreign powers, positioning yourself as the kingdom's savior. These are not the actions of a loyal advisor. The chamber fell silent as the implications of the king's words settled over everyone present. Lord Chancellor Aldwin shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that this confrontation had moved beyond matters of protocol into questions of loyalty and potential treason. Prince Roderick studied his brother's face for a long moment before responding, and when he did, his voice carried a new quality, the tone of someone who had decided to abandon pretense. Loyal advisor? Edmund, I have spent 3 months watching you struggle with problems that could be solved if you would simply acknowledge your limitations. The ancient document that Isabella discovered provides a clear path forward, but you refuse to consider it seriously because your pride won't allow you to admit that perhaps, just perhaps, someone else might be better suited to lead this kingdom through its current crisis. Ah, Edmund said, a bitter smile crossing his features. Now we approach the heart of the matter. You speak of the document that Isabella discovered so conveniently, just as you happened to return to court, just as the kingdom's financial situation reached its nadir. Tell me, brother, how long have you been planning this campaign? Roderick's expression shifted again, this time to something approaching admiration for his brother's perception. You're more observant than I gave you credit for, Edmund. Very well, let us speak plainly. Yes, the document's discovery was orchestrated. Yes, my return was timed to coincide with the kingdom's financial crisis. And, yes, Isabella, and I have been coordinating our efforts to present you with what we believe is the best solution for Valdoria's future. The admission hit the chamber like a thunderclap. Lord Chancellor Aldwin gasped audibly, while Edmund felt a mixture of vindication and betrayal wash over him. He had suspected the conspiracy, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a physical blow. Isabella, Edmund said quietly, my wife is part of this conspiracy. Your wife is a practical woman who recognizes that sometimes personal loyalties must be set aside for the greater good, Roderick replied. She approached me months ago, concerned about the kingdom's deteriorating situation and your apparent inability to address it effectively. We began discussing alternatives. The revelation about Isabella's role in initiating the conspiracy was perhaps the most painful part of his brother's confession. Edmund had suspected her of betraying him, but learning that she had actively sought out his replacement cut deeper than he had expected. And the ancient document. I suppose King Aldrich's will was conveniently forged to provide legal justification for your coup. Roderick shook his head, surprising his brother. Actually, the document is authentic. That was the most remarkable part of this entire situation. When Isabella's research into the palace's history uncovered the hidden chamber, the will was genuinely there. It was as if Providence itself was showing us the path forward. Edmund felt the ground shifting beneath him. An authentic royal decree changed the legal landscape entirely. If King Aldrich's will truly contained the provisions Isabella had presented to the council, then Roderick's actions, while morally questionable, might be legally defensible. So you see, brother, Roderick continued, his voice taking on a tone of reasonable explanation, this isn't really a coup in the traditional sense. It's simply the implementation of a legal mechanism that our ancestor foresaw might be necessary. The kingdom is in crisis, alternative leadership is available, and the law provides a clear process for transition. Lord Chancellor Aldwin finally found his voice. Prince Roderick, even if the document is authentic, its implementation requires proper legal procedures. The Royal Council would need to formally declare the king unfit to rule, and evidence would need to be presented. Evidence is already being compiled, Roderick interrupted smoothly. The kingdom's financial records speak for themselves. Edmund's health has been deteriorating visibly over the past month, raising questions about his fitness to continue ruling during such a critical period. And, most importantly, my own success in securing beneficial trade agreements demonstrates the kind of capability the ancient document requires. Edmund's blood ran cold as he realized the full scope of his brother's planning. The gradual poisoning hadn't been intended just to kill him. It was meant to provide visible evidence of his declining fitness to rule. The successful trade negotiations weren't just economic achievements. They were demonstrations of Roderick's superior capability. Every element of the conspiracy had been designed to build a legal case for his removal while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. "You've thought of everything," Edmund said quietly. "The poison to make me appear unfit, the trade deals to prove your capability, even my wife's betrayal to ensure you had access to my daily routine. It's remarkably thorough." Roderick's expression shifted to one of genuine surprise. "Poison? Edmund, what are you talking about?" The reaction seemed authentic, and Edmund found himself confused. If Roderick wasn't behind his gradual poisoning, then who was? The logical answer was Isabella, but why would she act independently of her co-conspirator? Before Edmund could pursue this line of thought, the throne room doors burst open, and Queen Consort Isabella entered, her usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "My lords," she said breathlessly, "forgive the interruption, but there are matters of extreme urgency that require immediate attention." Edmund studied his wife's face, looking for signs of deception or calculation, but what he saw instead was something that might have been genuine fear. The conspiracy was apparently taking turns that even its architects hadn't anticipated. "What matters?" Roderick demanded, his own composure slipping as he realized that whatever Isabella had discovered might complicate their carefully laid plans. "Asturian troops have been spotted massing at our eastern border," Isabella announced, her words falling into the chamber like stones into still water. "Our scouts report at least 5,000 soldiers, with more arriving daily. They appear to be preparing for invasion." The implications of this news crashed over everyone present like a wave. If Roderick had been negotiating with Asturian representatives, and if those negotiations had involved military intelligence or strategic information, then his actions might not have been innocent trade discussions, but potential acts of treason that had facilitated an enemy invasion. Prince Roderick's face had gone pale, and, for the first time since entering the chamber, he looked genuinely shaken. "That's impossible. My contacts assured me that Astoria had no military intentions toward Valdoria. Our agreements were purely commercial." "Your agreements," Edmund said quietly, "may have provided our enemies with exactly what they needed to plan an invasion. Trade routes, supply chains, economic vulnerabilities, troop movements. All of this information could be gleaned from the kind of detailed negotiations you've been conducting." The throne room fell silent, as everyone present grappled with the possibility that the kingdom faced not just internal political crisis, but external military threat. Edmund felt his mind racing, trying to process the implications of this development for both his personal situation and the kingdom's security. The game had just become exponentially more complex, and the stakes had risen beyond personal power to the very survival of Valdoria itself. The war council that convened within hours of Isabella's announcement was unlike any in Valdoria's recent history. The Great Strategic Chamber had been hastily arranged to accommodate not just military commanders, but also the key political figures whose decisions would determine the kingdom's response to the crisis. King Edmund sat at the head of the table, his illness momentarily forgotten in the face of existential threat to his realm. Despite everything that had transpired between them, Prince Roderick occupied the seat to his right. Whatever their personal conflicts, the kingdom's survival took precedence. Queen Consort Isabella sat across from them, her earlier agitation replaced by grim determination. Lord Commander Garrett spread detailed maps across the table's surface, his weathered hands tracing the positions where Asturian forces had been observed. "The intelligence is confirmed, Your Majesty." Our scouts report approximately 7,000 troops now assembled along the eastern border, with siege engines and supply trains still arriving. This is not a diplomatic show of force, it's preparation for full-scale invasion. Edmund studied the maps, his strategic mind automatically analyzing defensive options despite the turmoil of recent revelations. What is our current military readiness? Difficult to assess accurately, Garrett admitted with obvious reluctance. The recent war drained our regular forces, and financial constraints have delayed recruitment of replacements. We can muster perhaps 4,000 troops immediately, with another 1,000 available within a week if we call up reserves. The numbers were sobering. 7,000 enemy soldiers against 5,000 defenders was manageable odds under normal circumstances, but Valdoria's forces were undermanned, under-equipped, and owed several months of back pay. Morale was questionable at best. Prince Roderick leaned forward, his face still pale from the implications of his unwitting role in facilitating the crisis. The trade negotiations I conducted did involve discussions of supply routes and transportation infrastructure. If Asturian intelligence officers were among the representatives I met with, they could have gathered detailed information about our defensive capabilities and logistical vulnerabilities. It was a painful admission, but Edmund recognized his brother's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes in the face of external threat. Whatever Roderick's ambitions regarding the throne, he genuinely loved Valdoria and would not see it fall to foreign conquest. The question now is whether we can mount an effective defense with our current resources, Lord Commander Garrett continued. The eastern fortresses are in reasonable condition, but they were designed to delay invasion, not prevent it entirely. If Astoria commits to a sustained assault, we would need significant additional forces or external assistance. Isabella, who had remained silent during the military assessment, finally spoke. What about diplomatic solutions? Could we negotiate with Astoria to prevent invasion? From a position of weakness? Duke Harrison, who had arrived shortly after the council convened, shook his head grimly. Astoria knows our financial situation. They know our military limitations. If they're massing for invasion, it's because they believe they can succeed. Negotiation would simply give them more time to prepare. Edmund felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. Every decision made in the next few days could determine whether Valdoria survived as an independent kingdom or fell under foreign rule. Personal conflicts would have to be set aside in favor of national survival. Lord Commander, he said decisively, begin immediate mobilization of all available forces. Call up the reserves, send word to the noble houses that feudal obligations are now in effect, and prepare the eastern fortresses for siege. We will not make conquest easy for our enemies. Garrett nodded and began issuing orders to his subordinates, but Edmund could see doubt in the man's eyes. Military preparation was necessary, but everyone in the room understood that conventional defense might not be sufficient. There is another option, Roderick said quietly, his voice carrying a tone of reluctance that suggested he was about to propose something personally distasteful. My trading networks extend beyond Astoria. The northern kingdoms of Drakmor and Valenhall have no love for Asturian expansion. If we could offer them favorable terms, exclusive trading rights, territorial concessions, even military bases, they might be willing to provide military assistance. Edmund studied his brother's suggestion carefully. Alliance with foreign powers could indeed provide the military strength necessary to repel invasion, but it would come at the cost of Valdorian independence in other forms. Trading rights and territorial concessions could be as damaging to sovereignty as military conquest, just more gradual. What kind of concessions are we talking about? Duke Harrison asked, voicing the question everyone was considering. Roderick consulted notes he had brought to the council. Drakmor has been interested in access to our iron mines for years. Valenhall wants naval basing rights along our northern coast. Both kingdoms would want preferential trading status and reduced tariffs on their goods entering Valdorian markets. The terms were substantial, but Edmund found himself weighing them against the alternative of complete conquest by Astoria. Partial compromise of sovereignty was preferable to total loss of independence, but the decision would affect Valdoria's future for generations. How quickly could such arrangements be negotiated? Edmund asked. Given the urgency of our situation, perhaps a week for preliminary agreements, Roderick replied. Both kingdoms maintain embassies in the capital, and I have personal relationships with their trade representatives. If we're willing to offer substantial concessions, they might be willing to move quickly. Isabella had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, and now she leaned forward with an observation that cut to the heart of their dilemma. We're discussing trading away pieces of our kingdom's future to save it from immediate conquest. But what if there's a third option we haven't considered? All eyes turned to the queen consort, who had proven herself capable of surprising insights despite her controversial role in recent events. The ancient document that has caused so much conflict, Isabella continued, grants control of the most valuable royal assets to whoever can demonstrate capability to restore the kingdom's prosperity. What if those assets could be used not for personal gain, but for national defense? Edmund felt his breath catch as he understood the implications of his wife's suggestion. The Ravencrest Emerald Collection and the Northwood territories weren't just valuable in economic terms. They represented liquid assets that could be converted immediately into military resources. You're suggesting we use King Aldric's legacy assets to purchase defense of the realm? Lord Chancellor Aldwin asked, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern for the precedent such action would set. I'm suggesting we determine who among the royal household is most capable of leveraging those assets effectively for the kingdom's immediate survival, Isabella replied carefully. Whether that's King Edmund, Prince Roderick, or some combination of their efforts. The chamber fell silent as everyone present grappled with the implications of this proposal. It would mean implementing the controversial document's provisions, but for national defense rather than personal ambition. It would also mean acknowledging that the current crisis required extraordinary measures and possibly extraordinary leadership. Edmund looked around the table at the faces of his advisors and family members, seeing calculation and concern in equal measure. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. The document that had threatened his throne might now provide the key to saving his kingdom. The Emerald Collection alone could finance a substantial mercenary army, Roderick said thoughtfully. And the Northwood territories could provide timber and mineral rights to trade for weapons and supplies. But deploying these assets would require speed and expertise that traditional royal bureaucracy might not be able to provide. There was the crux of the matter. Edmund's traditional approach to governance, with its careful deliberation and proper protocols, was ill-suited to the current emergency. Roderick's more aggressive and flexible methods, while questionable in their political implications, might be exactly what the situation required. Brother, Edmund said slowly, the words difficult to speak, but necessary for the kingdom's survival. I believe the time has come to set aside personal conflicts in favor of national need. If you can use your networks and expertise to convert King Aldric's legacy into immediate military resources, then perhaps the document's provisions should be implemented temporarily. Roderick's expression showed surprise and something that might have been respect. Temporarily? Until the immediate crisis passes, Edmund clarified. A regency arrangement that grants you access to the specified assets and authority to use them for national defense, while maintaining the fundamental structure of royal authority. It was a compromise that neither brother found entirely satisfactory, but both recognized as necessary. Isabella nodded approvingly, while Lord Chancellor Aldwin began considering the legal mechanisms that would be required to implement such an arrangement. Very well, Roderick said formally. I accept temporary guardianship of King Aldric's legacy assets, to be used solely for the defense of Valdoria against foreign invasion. All actions taken under this authority to be reviewed by the Royal Council and subject to termination upon resolution of the current crisis. Edmund felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he agreed to this arrangement. He was voluntarily surrendering significant power to his brother, but doing so in service of a greater cause. The question now was whether Roderick would honor the temporary nature of the arrangement once the immediate threat had passed. Lord Commander, Edmund said, turning his attention back to immediate military concerns, how long do you estimate we have before Astrian forces begin their advance? Based on the observed buildup, perhaps a week, possibly less, Garrett replied. They appear to be waiting for additional siege equipment, but their current forces could begin preliminary attacks at any time. Then, we have 1 week to implement this new arrangement and marshal whatever resources it can provide, Edmund concluded. Prince Roderick, begin immediate negotiations with our potential allies. Lord Commander, continue military preparations. And may Providence help us all, because the next 7 days will determine whether Valdoria survives as a free kingdom. As the War Council dispersed to begin their desperate preparations, Edmund remained at the table, staring at the maps that showed enemy forces gathering at his kingdom's borders. He had prevented one form of conquest, his brother's political coup, only to face another in the form of foreign invasion. The irony was bitter, but there was no time for self-pity. In the distance, church bells began tolling the evening hour, their sound carrying across a kingdom that stood on the precipice of war. Edmund rose slowly from his chair, feeling the weight of his crown and his responsibility more keenly than ever before. Win or lose, the next week would be remembered as the moment when Valdoria either found the strength to survive or fell into the darkness of conquered history. The final game had begun, and the stakes could not be higher.